in the Bible we have three Josephs, but the one that we're going to concentrate on with our study is Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea was our Lord's great uncle. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, which comprised of 120 members of varying ages and degrees of status in the city of Jerusalem, including, of course, the religious faction, that is, as we would say today, the Jewish input of the Sanhedrin. Saul was the character that began this inquisition of the believers of the way. Among them, of course, was Stephen, who was martyred, stoned to death in the presence of Saul, which is recorded in the book of Acts. From that moment onwards, the Inquisition spread to any member of the New Testament faction that had connections with Jesus. It is also reported that each of the 12 original apostles of Christ also followed the pattern of Jesus, and they themselves appointed 12 distinct disciples. This was so particularly with disciples such as John and Thomas, for example. They being the two disciples that seem to have been on opposite courses of purpose. What happened at this point was that it was Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, members of the Sanhedrin, who, if you recall, took the body of Jesus from the cross and laid in him the new tomb that had not been used, which belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph was a very rich man. He had the title Noblesse Curio, which meant that he was in charge of the mining interests of the Roman Empire. It is reported he had 200 vessels sailing the high seas, taking items that were to be used to barter for the metals that were so needed by the Roman legions. There came a time when Joseph realized that he was on Saul's hit list, and so he felt that the time was ripe to move out of the area, and took a boat from Israel, Palestine, and sailed west and came eventually to the port of Marseille. Marseille was in southern Gaul, or today southern France, and still exists, of course. And with him he took 12 of the most likely companions who would be destined to the Inquisition of Saul. Baronius, who was later, of course, Cardinal Baronius, was one of the librarians in the Vatican, and it is his record that tells us of that event that I've just spoken of. There were very few Christian historians in the first 300-400 years of Christianity, but Gildas was one, and he wrote of the history of the early church in Britain on Steepholm, which lies in the Bristol estuary. So we have Joseph making his way to Britain, but first, of course, he would have to travel from Marseille through Gaul to the northern coast of France, and then cross the British Channel, the English Channel, to come to Britain. He was invited here by Arvigarus, who was the king of Cornwall at that time, and he was able to share with the Druids the Christian message, which was well received, and so he was asked to remain here. Philip the Evangelist became the apostle to Gaul, and he approved of this and actually came over to Britain and laid hands upon Joseph of Arimathea and ordained him in that particular category. So we have Joseph visiting Britain. Very interesting to know who he brought with him. And as I say, he brought at least a dozen of those who were destined to be part of Saul's inquisition. Of course, later Saul of Tarsus was converted on the Damascus Road and became an outstanding Christian apostle. Not one of the original 12, of course, but nevertheless to make his profound mark upon the early Christian faith. Among those that he brought with him across to Britain was Mary, Martha and Lazarus from Bethany, which was just east of the city of Jerusalem. I understand from the ancient records that Lazarus eventually became the bishop of Marseille, and that he is buried somewhere in the vicinity. But first he was in Britain. And another member of that group was Mary Magdalene, who came from Magdala on the west coast of the Sea of Galilee. She, if you remember, had been delivered by Jesus from evil demon spirits, and was then involved in the exorcism of those who were possessed by similar spirits here in the United Kingdom, in Britain. If you go to Glastonbury today and stand on the steps of the town hall and look directly across the main street, you will discover that that street is called Magdalene Street. It is named after Mary Magdalene. And there are records of ancient records in the Oxford University that tell of her works and the ministry that was given to her when she became a very vital part of the Christian church here in Britain. Another most interesting member of Joseph's party that came over to Britain was Mary, the mother of Jesus. She came, and the group made their way from the south coast to Avalon. Avalon was the original Celtic name of Glastonbury. The name Glastonbury means glass island. Not that glass was produced there, but that the tidal waters that surrounded the island often reflected the light and the beauty of the sun and the stars. Mary came, and she was buried actually at Avalon. And the little church or wattle church called the Oldie Church that was built there, some have testified, like Gildas, by the hands of Christ himself, was dedicated to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so we have this intriguing connection between Britain and the royal family, the family of Jesus Christ our Lord. Let me just remind you of some of the background of that family. The parents of the Virgin Mary were Anne and Joachim. Joachim was the brother of Joseph of Arimathea, not to be confused with the Joseph that Mary married to save her when her pregnancy was made known. No, this was Joseph of Arimathea, a small town north of the city of Jerusalem. Joseph had the title of Nobilis Decurio. He was in charge of all the mining arrangements under the Roman Empire. He was a very wealthy man, and it is reputed he owned at least 200 ships on the high seas. So Joseph came to Britain. He was introduced to Arvigarus, the King of Cornwall, who gave to that party 12 hides of ground. which covered most of the islands that surrounded Avalon. Now the tidal waters came in from south of present Weston-super-Mare as far as the village of Pilton. And only recently it has been suggested that Pilton housed another little wattle church which was very similar to the one that was to be found at Avalon. Avalon simply means Apple Island. So we have this intriguing situation where Mary travels over to Britain. She reposes here until the day of her death, and according to the ancient records, British records, was actually buried at Avalon. If you go and visit the ancient ruins at Glastonbury today, you'll find that the ancient wattle church is clearly marked out there from its original foundations. It also, of course, boasts that wonderful tree which is reputed to be the staff of Joseph of Arimathea when it was planted into the ground and became a living thorn tree. Even to this day, flowers are selected by the children of Glastonbury and sent to the royal family, latterly of course to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, and adorn her Christmas table. And so we have this remarkable evolving of the Christian faith here in Britain. Now, following with the death of Virgin Mary's husband, Joseph, while Jesus was a young teenager, according to Jewish law, Joseph became the legal guardian of the family. Jesus and his mother had moved to Nazareth from Nazareth to Capernaum about this time, as recorded in Matthew's Gospel. So arriving at Marseille, Joseph and his companions were, as I say, later invited to Britain. Now Joseph of Arimathea was fully aware of the mystery of Jesus' birth, and no doubt knew his destiny too. In the Latin Vulgate of the Gospel of Mark, Joseph is referred to as a decurio. This was a Roman term simply meaning in charge of administration. When Joseph arrived at Avalon, they decided, the company that was with him, to reside there. And that is why Glastonbury became the seat of Christianity here in Britain. According again to Baronius, the companions of Joseph included the names that I have mentioned to you, and they also resorted and resided in Glastonbury for some short time. Now, let's just look at the lineage aspect of the characters that I've already mentioned to you. Anne and Joachim were the parents of the Virgin Mary. Now, who was Joachim? Joachim was the brother of Joseph of Arimathea. And so we find that Joachim married Anne, and Anne, she came from Gaul. In fact, she was known as a princess of repute, but she had been married to a Gaulish prince of much older years who had abused her, and she implored Joseph of Arimathea to take her back to his home. They found just shortly afterwards that her husband had died, which left her free to marry Joseph of Arimathea's brother Joachim.